Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here today. First of all, our lecture is being held on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the elders of other communities who might be here today. My name is Dorcas Utkovic, and I am the project coordinator for Nelson Mandela Day Commemorative Committee. As I said, I would like to welcome you all, and I feel very privileged to be standing in front of you today to commemorate the great Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Some of you, or I assume most of you, know about him, and this is why you're here, to hear more about his incredible work. So I hope we're going to have a great evening together, and we're going to learn a little bit more about the great man and other things along the way. Just a little brief background about Nelson Mandela Day celebration, and I'm sure other speakers might touch on it as well as we go. But the United Nations General Assembly launched the Nelson Mandela International Day in 2009 to be held on the 18th of July in recognition of Nelson Mandela's birthday. One of the many things that this day does or encourages people to do is to devote at least 67 minutes of your time, either on the actual day or any other day for that matter, in doing community service. And in doing so, we can all realize the potential to make an imprint and help the world we live in change in a positive way. And as part of the Nelson Mandela Commemorative Committee here in Melbourne, we also have a brand new project which is geared at the young people, because they are the future. And if we teach from a young age, we can make sure that this legacy is upheld for future generations. And the project is called Nelson Mandela 365, Youth 365. And what it does is it encourages young people to live and uphold Nelson Mandela's way of life, the way of Ubuntu, 365 days of the year, so pretty much every single day of our lives. So as the program goes on, I will continue to tell you a little bit more about it. I don't want to bore you. I'm excited to hear about the lecture, so I'll leave you with that one for a little bit. But I just want to tell you a little bit about my experience, my Madiba experience, if I can. When I was 10 years old, and it was on the 11th of February 1990, a very prominent day that most people might remember. So I had no idea that, about the significance of that day, because I was only 10 years old. And my parents and other grown-ups were huddled up again, in front of the TV, and it was just so quiet and it was intense. And we, the children, were just freely playing outside in the sunshine of the township, back home in Mamelodi, and it was just another day for us. Until suddenly we heard somebody shout with so much joy, and just after that, the energy in the township just changed, and there was music in the air, and from a distance we could hear the songs of struggle and the songs of triumph, and there was just this happiness happening in the air. And we realized that, later when I grew up, I realized that Nelson Mandela had been released from prison after 27 years. So it was on that day. And so, like I said, I was 10 years old and it did not make sense at the time. But looking back now, I realized that that day was very significant for people like myself, because on that day, we were afforded something very expensive that most people take for granted, called freedom. And so, because of Nelson Mandela and others who, did the work that he did, who were in prison with him and fought for the struggle and all that kind of stuff back home, I was able to travel. And here I am today in Australia, one of the lucky ones to have come by choice, and I can enjoy life with my family, with my friends in front of you, and it is largely because of that day. And that's just one day. There are many around that day. And so I just wanted to share that little bit with you because it's, I don't know the man personally, but I feel like he is such, he's the father of the nation. He is a citizen of the world. He's a multiculturalist. And so he is very significant in our history. And I am so happy to be connected to the Nelson Mandela Day Commemorative Committee because we are all here, firstly, because of the women and men who work so tirelessly to put such occasions together and to actually get us to learn about Nelson Mandela. So could we please just give a round of applause to the Nelson Mandela Day Commemorative Committee. So yes, thank you so much, guys. And now, without further ado, there's just a little housekeeping. Out the door, if you turn to your left, up the stairs, there's the bathrooms there, and there's tea and coffee outside and something to drink as well. And we'll give you a little bit more information as the program progresses. But now I would like to call to stage Professor Pauline Senton, Head of School of Management at RMIT.
Thank you, Dorcas. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and their elders, past and present. And on behalf of the School of Management at RMIT, I would also like to say Wominjeka, which is welcome in the Wurundjeri language I've been practicing. This is a very special occasion tonight, the second Nelson Mandela lecture to be given by Professor Gary Foley. And it's a real honour and a privilege to be able to welcome you all here tonight. First, because this is the Nelson Mandela Lecture, and at a time of so much ugliness and uncertainty in the world, to be able to celebrate the life of a man who was known for his dignity, his perseverance, his courage, and his wisdom is very special. And Nelson Mandela was also known for his humanity, his ability to forgive and to look forward with hope for a better future. And also, as we saw from the video clip, his ability to dance and his sense of humour. Second, it's also an honour because of the calibre of the guest speaker tonight, the man who is giving the Nelson Mandela Lecture. Professor Gary Foley has done so much for his community over the years. Again, a man of courage and integrity, who is not afraid to lead the fight against injustice and to call it as he sees it, and to say and do things that sometimes people don't want to hear or don't want to see. Welcome, Gary, tonight. And third, the third reason is that I'm actually very proud of RMIT at the moment, because 12 months ago we launched the Reconciliation Action Plan to drive improved opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to promote and to strengthen relationships and respect between Indigenous people and other Australians. And it also reminds the non-Indigenous university community that Australia not only has an Indigenous past, an Indigenous history, but also an Indigenous present, and a community whose contribution and value, if we choose to recognise and value it, will have a tremendous influence on our future. So, welcome again, prepared to be challenged, and thank you for joining us tonight on this very special occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pauline Stanton. And yes, Pauline and the rest of the RMIT staff have helped us to make this day happen. So thank you so much for that. We really appreciate that. And next, I'd like to introduce Arthur Muliko, who is the Chairperson of Nelson Mandela Day Commemorative Committee.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the elders of other communities that may be here. On behalf of the Nelson Mandela Commemorative Committee, NMDCC, I would like to thank the RMIT for hosting this illustrious event, and also thank all the volunteers who helped to organize and promote this event. A very special thank you goes out to our guest speaker tonight, Professor Gary Foley, who committed to being with us here tonight despite a family tragedy. On behalf of the NMDCC, I wish to extend our most sincere condolences to you and your family. And welcome to the second Nelson Mandela Lecture. The first Nelson Mandela Lecture was delivered by Professor Penny Andrews of the University of Cape Town at Victoria Parliament. It was a room full of politicians, if I may say so. Very successful. But since then, the NMDCC committee decided to move the lecture to the people. And I must say, wow, what a turnout. And I thank you all for turning up tonight. The story of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela is the story of the African people of South Africa, a nation dispossessed of their land and subjected to untold human degradation, economic exploitation, and political subjugation. And up until today, they're still languishing in poverty. Our people shall never be free until they are free from poverty. It is their most fundamental aspiration, and one of which the young democracy that is Mandela's legacy has so far failed to deliver. Systemic government corruption and an unprecedented crime wave that has swept across South Africa is threatening Mandela's vision of the Rainbow Nation. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, these are just some of the challenges, the great challenges facing Mandela's legacy inside South Africa. And on a global scene, Mandela's legacy of forgiveness and reconciliation faces more challenges, as we have witnessed with the slaughter of innocents in London, Syria, and other parts of the world. It is the aim and purpose of these lectures to engage and to inform future generations and future leaders about Mandela's values of Ubuntu, or as I may say in my mother tongue, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. I am because you are, and you are because I am. We hope you enjoy tonight's lecture and take home with you some lessons on Mandela's legacy of Ubuntu. I thank you all.
Thank you, Arthur, for those lovely words. And our next item is supposed to be the Honourable Inga Polish, who is running crazy in the city because the city is a standstill with traffic. We all know it was a little bit difficult to get here, but we'll move her to a little bit later. However, right now I would like to welcome the mother of us all in the community. We love her so much. And she is, Inga's here. She is an academic at RMIT, and she's also a member of the Nelson Mandela Day Commemorative Committee, holding the portfolio of a treasurer. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Ntati Ramezi. Sorry, everyone. Hello, Inga. Have you caught your breath? Yeah, you do, you're ready. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Honourable Inga Polish, please.
Good evening, and could I first of all say, extend a very profuse apology for being late. 2 reasons. The city is in gridlock. Surprise, surprise. Second reason, I attribute my European origins to always getting the directions wrong. But nonetheless, I'm here, and I do apologise, as I said, for not being here to hear the opening remarks. Could I congratulate the organisers on proceeding with a wonderful concept, the Nelson Mandela Lecture, great inspiration to our African communities, in fact to the world. And in particular, I think it was the first one, which we had held in Parliament of Victoria, was inspirational, and the parking was easier. But unfortunately, we were under construction at the moment, so it's a little bit more difficult. So could I just suggest that next year that you think about relocating it again into the parliamentary chambers, because the construction would have been completed. You'll be able to get it for nothing, and parking will be plentiful. Sorry? Yes, well, you can certainly catch the tram up there as well, and the train's right across the way. The African communities that continue to be an inspiration to me. The amount of talent, the level of activity in here as a diaspora is simply amazing, and there's just energy, achievement, creativity, all no doubt stemming from a couple of things. Number one, when people migrate to another place, they often do so because they haven't necessarily enjoyed the opportunities that many in the first world countries or Western world do enjoy, the freedom, the choice, the opportunities, whether they are financial resources or simply, as I said, an opportunity to pursue one's passions. So migrating to a place where things are more readily available does open many doors. And I've been to some schools. We're not talking about African children, we're talking about children, say, from the Middle East, who have been able to make up academic ground equivalent to 4 years of education in a single year, simply because they're given the key to education, have the opportunity to learn how to read and write. Imagine that. And as I've also mentioned to people in the past, my mother, who was functionally illiterate, a child of the war in a concentration camp, came out here with my father and 2 small children with a bag full of dreams, and she was a woman who, as I said, even now has enormous trouble understanding something that might be particularly legalistic or formal, and if she gets the letter, she brings it to me for me to read so that she is comfortable about the contents. But she came here with 3 dreams. One was to run a business, which I'm delighted to say our multicultural communities lead the way in small business ownership and entrepreneurship. And that sounded pretty ambitious, but for a person who doesn't read or write all that well, it was a significant dream. She was able to achieve that dream with the assistance of my father, who was a double degree graduate and an accountant. She wanted her children to do well. And of course, there's always criticism, but I can say that we certainly did a lot better than we would have over in our country of birth, then the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, in a mixed marriage. We would have probably been lucky to have stayed alive. And she wanted to learn how to drive a car. which she managed to achieve at the age of 50, and she's now 84, recently celebrated her 84th birthday. The health isn't that flash, but you know what? She still drives her little Barina, she goes to the doctor, she does her shopping, she visits her friends, and she comes over to my house so we can argue a little bit. It is a place of dreams. Sometimes they're modest and humble dreams, and sometimes they're fairly grandiose. But nonetheless, those dreams we can actually access. And she feels like a woman fulfilled. No, of course, life is not a bed of roses. There are lots of thorns, and there are lots of hardships and lots of challenges. But we do have the opportunities that we wouldn't have enjoyed if we had stayed where we were born. So people come to Australia from all walks of life, and we hope that Australians are generously hearted to really believe in the ethos, in the aspirations of this nation, that doesn't matter what colour you are, what religion you are, where you've come from, that you will be judged by your conduct and your actions and not by characteristics and attributes. And yes, often we fall far short of that aspiration, and it's up to each and every one of us to reaffirm what Australia stands for, what we stand for, what we will tolerate and what we won't tolerate. The process of migration, so therefore, does unlock and open doors, but also the process of adaptation to a new environment. Sometimes it's incredibly creative, and I think we as an Australian, as Australia as a nation, benefit from that sort of creativity, of the talents and the aspirations and the work of people from all over the world. And there's probably none that lead the way better than African communities, because there's no greater diversity than we see in the African communities, whether it's regional, whether it's the number of countries who make up the continent, whether it's religious, whether it's tribal. There is enormous, much greater diversity than, of course, we have enjoyed here. So it is inevitable that in the process of migration, there will be enormous opportunities unlocked. And I guess exploring some of those challenges under the umbrella of the Nelson Mandela Lectures is a great opportunity to identify those barriers and those challenges that present not only, of course, to our African diaspora, our African communities, but the community at large, is a great initiative. So could I just congratulate the organisers on the initiative. There are a few visionaries that are better and more warmly embraced than Nelson Mandela, irrespective of your politics. He was a man head and shoulders above the rest. So great concept. I hope that tonight's lecture is equally as challenging and inspirational as was the first one, and it's great to see so many younger people in the audience today than your inaugural lecture. Could I congratulate the organisers? I look forward to listening to the speaker and know that whatever it is that African communities get behind will be an enormous success, and I hope tonight is as well. Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be able to join you.
Thank you so much, Honourable Inga Polic. You made it, yes. And we'll try that again. Let's introduce the beautiful Dr. Ntati Ramezi.
Thank you, Dorcas. Before I introduce Professor Gary Foley, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to past and present. Now, starting to introduce the professor, Professor Gary Foley was born in Crafton, northern New South Wales. He then moved to Sydney as an apprentice draftsperson. In 2012, he completed a PhD in history at the University of Melbourne. He has worked at Victoria University since 2008 as a professor of history. He is a director of the Moondani Balluk Indigenous Academic Unit at Victoria University. As part of the Moondani Balluk Indigenous Academic Unit, Professor Foley maintains close links and relationships with the Kure community, government, students, and researchers by providing assistance and support for students, promoting Aboriginal and Torres Islander research and researchers, collaborating with and supporting community groups. Since his young age, Professor Foley has been at the center of major political activities, including the Springbok tour demonstrations, Tent Embassy in Canberra, Commonwealth Games protests during the bicentennial celebrations. Professor Foley, I remember that in the late 80s and early 90s, during the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, In several occasions, you joined the South African community and the Australian anti-apartheid movement in demonstrating against the apartheid activities in South Africa. Professor Gary, the South African community, Africans in general, are grateful to you and all Australians for your support. Professor Foley was also involved in the establishment of the first Aboriginal self-help and survival organizations, including Red Fern Aboriginal Legal Service, Aboriginal Health Service in Melbourne, National Black Theatre. In 1974, he was part of an Aboriginal delegation that toured China, and in 1978, he took films on Black Australia to the Cairns Film Festival. Professor Foley has been a director of the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service, Aboriginal Arts Board, and Aboriginal Medical Service in Redfern. He's been a senior lecturer at Swinburne College, consultant to the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody, board member of the Aboriginal Legal Service. He has also been on the national executive of the National Coalition of Aboriginal Organizations. In 1994, Professor Foley created the first Aboriginal-owned and operated website when he created the Kuri History website, which remains one of the most comprehensive Aboriginal education resources available today online. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Foley has done a lot in life, and I can go on and on until tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, join RMIT University, the School of Management, and Nelson Mandela Day Commemorative Committee in welcoming Professor Gary to deliver his speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Special thanks to the Nelson Mandela Commemorative Committee for inviting me to do this talk tonight. Thank you to RMIT as well. Thank you to my boss for being here. And I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land here in Melbourne who have tolerated me making trouble on their homelands for 45 years. Because I'm a professor of history and because history is my obsession, I'm going to take the opportunity tonight to either refresh the memories of those Australians present in particular, otherwise give those Australians and others here a little bit of an understanding about what I consider to be the common experience of the colonised peoples of Africa and in particular the people of South Africa and the Aboriginal people of Australia. And in doing so, create a little bit of a context for a potentially controversial thing that I may say somewhere further down the track tonight. But let's talk about race in Australia. It's important, and most Australians, anyone who went to school who's my age or younger, has not really been taught the truth of Australian history. And there, as Nelson Mandela himself illustrated, there can be no reconciliation without facing up to the truth. And the truth of Australian history is important because we cannot really make any progress in developing whatever we're trying to develop in Australia today without some sort of an understanding of those truths. And I'll start off with a quote from the elder professor of anatomy at the University of Adelaide, around about the beginning of the 20th century. Aborigines are too low on the scale of humanity to benefit from the civilising influence of Anglo-Saxon rule. And thus, folks, At the time of Federation, when Australia became Australia, Aboriginal people were regarded as subhuman. This came about because of a whole range of theories, eugenics, social Darwinism and other ideas. But the important thing is that most people don't realise that Australia became Australia in order to become a haven for white men. One of the strongest arguments advanced for Federation were about race, the need for a common policy to restrict the number in particular of Chinese people entering the colonies. This came about as a result of the gold rush in Victoria. The need to keep all non-white peoples out of a new nation that would be called Australia. So let's look at Federation for a moment or three. This image here sort of sums up the attitude of the British in Australia about the time of Federation. The British had realised that in Australia they were not part of Europe. They weren't surrounded by nice, pretty white people. They were surrounded by not only people who were non-white, they were surrounded by people who were non-white in large numbers. And naturally, well, not naturally, this tended to freak out the British at the time. And here's a few examples of some of the racist propaganda that made up part of the lead-in to Federation in Australia. This is a particularly notoriously racist cartoon that appeared in the Bulletin in 1886. Here's an ad from furniture maker from Fitzroy. Is your furniture built by white or yellow labour, folks? I'm the white homes of white Australia. How about white Australian pineapples, folks, you know? It'd be awful to eat anything that wasn't white Australian pineapples. The White Australia game, the White Australia puzzle, get the coloured men out and the white men in. Musicals, Australia, the white man's land, White Australia. Theatre, White Australia or the empty north, thereby expressing the great fear of that period. It seemed to me that the British at the time of Federation realised how easy it had been for them to move in and take over, and forcibly take over the land of the Aboriginal peoples. And that with the sudden realisation that there wasn't many of them here, the British at the time, and that Australia was surrounded by large numbers of non-white people, they probably realised just how easy it might be for some other mob to come in and take over this land from them, hence all of this paranoia and xenophobia. This particular masthead on the Bulletin was still there when I was 16 years old, folks, Australia for the white man. And here's this cartoon really sums up what Federation, the creation of Australia, was really all about. It was all about, in particular at that moment in time, keeping out what they thought of or called the yellow hordes. And so we come to Federation, folks. The opening of the first Parliament of Australia, not far from where we are tonight, just up the road in the Carlton Gardens. And what was the first act of the first Parliament of Australia? Why, folks, it was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, better known as the White Australia policy. And this was a policy that was at the heart of Australian consciousness and Australian culture for the greater part of the 20th century. This policy was still alive, strong and living when I was 21 years old, folks. So, Australia is born on the basis of white supremacist ideas. Race was then, and remains today, I put to you, central to political, economic and social ideas and policy. Australia, for most of the 20th century, was a xenophobic and hostile nation to external non-white peoples. And just to kill a butterfly with a sledgehammer, what did some of Australia's early Prime Ministers have to say on the subject of race? First Australian Prime Minister, the doctrine of the equality of man was never intended to apply to the equality of the Englishman and the Chinaman. Second Australian Prime Minister, unity of race is an absolute essential to the unity of Australia. Third Australian Prime Minister, he supported the establishment of a great white democracy, a white British-based culture that would flourish as the new Commonwealth of Australia. The fourth Australian Prime Minister supported the determination of the Australian people that we should have a white Australia. The fifth Australian Prime Minister advocated preventing the introduction of aliens to destroy the purity of the Australian people. The sixth Australian Prime Minister. In the first place, our objective is an Australia, white, free, federal. The eighth Australian Prime Minister, the famous Billy Hughes, our chief plank is, of course, a white Australia. There is no compromise about that. The industrious coloured brother has to go and remain away. The ninth Australian Prime Minister, we intend to keep this country white and not allow its peoples to be faced with the problems in many parts of the world. So there you go, folks. That's at least 9 of the first Australian Prime Ministers expressing very strongly ideas of white supremacy. Thus, in the early 1900s, Australia was a cauldron of ideas of white supremacy, eugenics and social Darwinism. These ideas evolved into the Australian version of apartheid. The Australian version of apartheid was implemented by a white majority against a black minority, whereas the South African version differed only in that it was implemented by a white minority against a black majority. And therein rested the inevitability that it would be ultimately overcome in South Africa. I'm going to take a great leap forward to 1965 and bring myself into the picture, folks. In 1965, I was 15 years old, living here on the north coast of New South Wales. That, for those of you who don't know, is a map of the 500 different Aboriginal language groups, Aboriginal nations that were here for thousands of years BC, before Cook, and extensive historical research conducted by myself, and I know that some of you have heard this joke already. Extensive historical research conducted by myself has established that in the last 10,000 years, by far, of all of those 500 different nations, the best looking were the Gumbaynggirr people, who just so happened to be, what a remarkable coincidence, my mob folks. So there I was in 1965. And here's me in 1965, and those of you who are hard of sight, there he is there. Now you may notice, the more astute among you, that here is an Australian high school class in 1965 in northern New South Wales. There's only one little blackfella in that class, which in itself is a remarkable thing, because where I come from, unlike down here, the killing fields of Australia, where I come from, the Gumbaynggirr people survived the initial invasion and occupation of their land much more successfully than the people down here, to the extent where in 1965, when this photograph was taken, the Gumbaynggirr people still comprised up to a quarter of the local populace. In other words, we were visible and there were a lot of us. And this high school served the 3 major towns in the Nambucca Valley in 1965. And yet, there were only 3 Aboriginal students in that high school, and there's one of them there, folks. Now, what that says to you, what that tells you, is the extent to which well past the halfway point of the 20th century, that shows you, illustrates to you, the extent to which Aboriginal people were still being deliberately and systematically denied educational opportunities. My generation was the first generation of Aboriginal people in New South Wales to be allowed to get just a little bit of education. Not too much, mind you, a little bit. And as we all know, a little bit of education can be a dangerous thing. But the other thing that this picture will tell you about Australia well into the 20th century, look at that photo. The only non-white face in that photograph is the little Kuri bloke, the Guri bloke, the Gumbanja boy. There's no other cultures to be seen. There again is an illustration of the extent and power well into the 20th century of the White Australia policy, excluding virtually all non-white peoples from living and being in Australia. The other thing that this photograph tells you, this also is an example of the era of segregation, the Australian apartheid in action. I could sit next to any of these kids in this class, in the classroom during the week at school. On the weekends, when in 1965 in rural New South Wales, the only entertainment for 15-year-old kids like us was the local picture theatre, I couldn't sit next to any of these kids. Why? Because the picture theatre was segregated, you know? And that's just a little illustration of Australia well into the 20th century. Now, not long after this photograph was taken, I was hauled into the headmaster's office and I was arbitrarily expelled with these words. The headmaster said to me, "Don't come back next year, Foley." And I said, "Why not?" Because I was going pretty good. I was going better than most of these, academically better than most of these white kids in my class, these apprentice rednecks. And he said to me, he arbitrarily expelled me with these words. He said, "We don't want your kind here." In doing so, he not only expelled me, he largely demolished my self-esteem and in particular my self-confidence, but worse still, he destroyed my belief in education to such an extent that it was 30 years before I finally realised that I was capable of going to university. And I went and signed up at Melbourne Uni and kicked a lot of arse. But 30 years it took me to overcome that destruction of my self-confidence by that headmaster. Now, after being expelled from Maxwell High School, I headed to Sydney. I got caught up towards the end of the 1967 referendum campaign. Now, that's important. The referendum campaign is important in terms of the context I'm talking about today, because that referendum was in part about bringing to an end, an attempt to bring to an end the apartheid system that had been constructed in Australia that wasn't a single creature. The different states had different laws, different apartheid-style laws that restricted a whole range of aspects of the life of Aboriginal people. And to explain that a little bit, here's the person who, the main genius behind this 1967 referendum campaign.
The fairest thing for the Commonwealth Government to do is perhaps hold a referendum.
The Aboriginal people lived under 6 different laws. Each state had its own law. We needed the state laws to be abolished for this reason, that they created such tremendous confusion. You could be a relatively free person walking around Victoria, and you come to New South Wales and you find you've got to go up to Bridge Street in Sydney to get permission if you can go and see your uncle or aunt, if you please. Then if you move over the border into Queensland, well, the very fact that you go over the border into Queensland, you could be arrested without reason. So there was a great need to abolish those state laws and to bring everyone under the common law, the federal law. So that is the main reason why it was important to have a referendum. We had to change the federal constitution.
Now, that was a remarkable referendum, because 90% of the Australian people voted yes, and yet it changed nothing. And it was because of the failure of the 67 referendum to bring about any meaningful change that the younger generation, which included me, chose to educate ourselves politically, reject the tactics of the older generation, and opt for more radical measures. And as a result, a new movement emerged in Australia. The term black power entered the Australian political language in 1969, not far from here, out at Northcote, near Westgarth Station, when an otherwise obscure Caribbean academic by the name of Professor Dr. Roosevelt Brown, visited the Aborigines Advancement League and just made a little speech. And what he was talking about was black power, and what he meant was economic and political independence, self-determination, the fundamental right of all human beings to control their own destiny, to determine their own future. And yet this was the reaction of the typical, this was the predictable reaction of the tabloid media in Australia, which tried to generate all sorts of hysteria about the notion of black power, not understanding what it meant. So in Redfern, where I was, the new black power movement emerged.
There should be economic sanctions passed against Australia. There should be sporting ties should be severed, cultural ties should be severed. We have got to work towards the ultimate objective, and that we are economically, culturally and socially independent. Land rights is a means to this.
Present society just offers nothing for black people. It only offers police suppression, constant ridicule, kids die from malnutrition, we get constant racist, sort of derogative marks in schools, we get sort of institutionalised in the form of the education syllabus where black people are taught to think of themselves as Jackie. There is no positive sort of image of black people in this society. It's run by the controlled or used by the white media. Now we want to change all this.
And the way we saw changing it was through self-determination. That's what black power meant to us. We believe that the means towards self-determination rested in the idea of economic independence. If we could gain economic independence, then we'd be in a position to determine our own destiny. And we said to ourselves, well, what do we need as the first step of the way towards economic independence? And we said to ourselves, land rights, land as an economic base. That's what we saw as being, that's why we saw land as being important. And when we talked about land rights, we weren't talking about this Mickey Mouse native title stuff you hear about today that people in Australia have been conned into thinking gave land justice to Aboriginal people. When we talked about land rights, we were talking about proper ownership of land, not some obscure, easily gotten rid of interest in land, which is what native title is. But I'm not going to go into too much detail here because we're taking a lightning 100-year trip through Australian history and I've got to run. Black power was all about...
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
Malcolm X was a very important influence and inspiration on the movement here. And I just want to mention a couple of... just some of the important major influences on the Black Power movement in Australia. Another was Frantz Fanon, who I still recommend to my students today to read his works. We're also particularly interested in Che and Fidel and Ho Chi Minh for obvious reasons, anyone who knows anything about history and politics. But we're also very conscious of what was going on throughout Africa, both in southern Africa and other parts of Africa. And that was the image of Nelson that we had for most of my life until he finally got out of jail. The person who imbued in us young people in Redfern our understanding of what was going on in Africa, and especially with apartheid in South Africa, was this man. This man was the Oscar Wilde of Black Australia. John Newfong was the first Aboriginal professional journalist in Australia, but he had, for some reason, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the history and politics of many parts of Africa, and the whole history of colonialism, the whole history of the struggles against colonialism, and it was him who, more than anyone else, imbued in us and that crucial understanding of what was going on, and especially in South Africa in particular, because we could relate to the plight and the struggle of the people in South Africa, because we felt that what was going on to us in New South Wales and Queensland in particular seemed to be fairly identical to the situation that they were confronting over there. The only difference was that we were up against a white majority, and we always earnestly believed that in the long run, the good thing about what was going to happen in South Africa was that there was clearly they were going to win. We could see that there was no question that they would win. But then every time something happened in South Africa, especially the shootings of the students in Soweto, we felt that pain, you know. We related so strongly, so powerfully to our brothers and sisters in Southern Africa. And so we felt their pain, and because like I said, we felt that that was what was going on with us. In 1971, the Aboriginal political movement received a huge political boost as a direct result of the visit to Australia by a bunch of Afrikaner rugby players, the South African Springbok rugby tour of that period. Large numbers of white Australians started demonstrating in the streets against that tour, and we went along to some of their early demonstrations and offered them a challenge. You know, we said, well, it's great you're demonstrating in support of our brothers and sisters in South Africa, but you should also consider the situation that exists here in Australia as well. And to their credit, the anti-Springbok, the anti-racist Australians who were part of those demonstrations saw the merit in our challenge. But the best thing that happened in the Springbok tour, we had a Black Power commune in Bondi Junction. We'd moved out of Redfern because of the heat from the police, and we had a commune in a building in Bondi Junction. And when the Springbok team turned up in Sydney, the government and the police had gone to extreme lengths to keep secret where the Springbok team were going to be housed during their stay in Sydney. And lo and behold, they turned up across the road from our Black Power commune.
Springboks came out. For some reason, they were installed in a motel that was 2 doors away from our big black commune.
So the Aboriginal activists' house ended up being a headquarters for us, and they were very, very prominent in the demonstration outside.
We were approached by a guy who had played rugby for Australia in South Africa, and in South Africa had acquired these 3 genuine Springbok football jumpers. He said, when I was in South Africa, the mere proposition that any black person would ever wear this revered and haloed symbol of Afrikanerdom, it would make the Broeder Bond have a heart attack. So 3 of us put these football guernseys on, and all we did was stand at the front of the vigil. It was worth it just to see the looks on these big South African rugby players' faces. They were furious, and if there hadn't been a lot of police there, they probably would have killed us.
The other thing that happened was that the Aboriginal activists challenged us to be more involved in Aboriginal issues.
One of the remarkable public relations coups that successive Australian governments have managed to maintain is to have created the image of Australia as not really being a racist country, when in actual fact it's one of the most racist societies in the Western world.
We had the White Australia policy, which meant there were to be no non-white immigrants into Australia. We had a very, very patronising attitude and a very racist attitude towards Aboriginal people.
We are the only country on earth with a legal system which denies any title in land whatever to the original inhabitants. The Rhodesians do, the South Africans do, we don't.
It prompted a fundamental rethink in themselves about, well, what is our position, you know? They were forced to confront that sort of issue, and none of them had ever done that before. So it was good and healthy.
The Aboriginal groups in Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Melbourne took a major part in those demonstrations, and in turn that generated a huge reservoir of goodwill and support within the Australian political scene for our struggle for land rights at the time, to such an extent that our demonstrations for land rights became bigger with the influx of anti-apartheid demonstrators, and this one of the things that occurred during that tour. This is a particularly famous or notorious image of me during the Springbok tour, an image that's been sort of reproduced all over the world in recent times. And if you want to come and see me later, I'll sell you a T-shirt with it on. One of the other interesting, weird, bizarre things that happened during the 71 tour, this here is the present Foreign Minister of Zimbabwe, Mr. Simba Mumbengegwe, who was a friend of ours who went to Monash University at the time of the Springbok tour. And this was a stunt that the anti-apartheid crew pulled with Simba's cooperation. I don't know how he'd feel about it today, me showing you this picture, but this was one of the more effective stunts that was pulled during that period. It's just a little clip from...
You know what? In the long run, I reckon we'd be better off with a more restrictive immigration policy.
One of the most successful political actions of the 20th century mounted by Aboriginal people was the Aboriginal Embassy, which came about as a direct result of the raising of awareness during the Springbok tour in 1971. These four guys went to Canberra in 26th of January 1972, pitched a tent. The plan was just to have a little demonstration here, get a photo taken. That was the photo we wanted taken, to appear in the Canberra Times newspaper the next morning so that the Prime Minister, Billy McMahon, when he woke up in the lodge, would choke on his cornflakes, seeing a bunch of blackfellas on his lawn. And that was all that was supposed to happen. But accidentally, these guys discovered a loophole in Canberra law. When this police person came, he was supposed to arrest him. But the police person didn't stick to the script, and he pointed out to the boys there was no law against camping on the lawns of Parliament House. So for the next 6 months, the Aboriginal Embassy was born. The Aboriginal Embassy being a demonstration that, like I said, captured the imagination.
Good evening. For the first time in history, there's an Aboriginal Embassy in Canberra. It's been on the lawns in front of Parliament House for some weeks. The fact that it's there at all has surprised many white Australians, and the fact that it's been there for so long has surprised even more. But for Australia's Aborigines, it's not just a matter of surprise. It's made 1972 different from any other year. It's one symbol of their growing determination to be noticed. The embassy is just one aspect of a new phase in the relationship between white and black Australians. The other is an issue, land rights. The setting up of an embassy and the intensive pressure for land rights comes from a new generation of Aboriginal spokesmen and leaders. On the whole, they're younger, more impatient and more militant than their predecessors. They're not the only Aboriginal spokesmen, of course, and they're not the only ones arguing for land rights, but they're the ones who are giving the movement its biggest push yet. And in one way or another, what they're about is black power.
We gave ourselves portfolios. I became the Minister for Defence. We had the Minister of the Environment. I painted the curb. Aboriginal Embassy staff only, no parking. So we were sending them up. We were known worldwide because we used to get letters from overseas. Aboriginal tent embassy somewhere in Australia.
The reason the Aboriginal Embassy was so important historically is because this moment, when Gough Whitlam, who was then the leader of the opposition, come to big note himself and make a speech in front of the lawn, he was challenged by Paul Coe, who pointed out that, hang on, Mr Whitlam, your political party, the Labor Party, your policy on Aboriginal people is assimilation. Assimilation equals genocide. The government's policy on Aboriginal people is assimilation. Both major political parties in this country since Federation have had a bipartisan policy of assimilation for Aboriginal people. Assimilation equals genocide because the desired end result of a policy of assimilation is that there be no Aboriginal people. Gough Whitlam saw the logic in Paul Coe's argument and overnight changed the policy of the ALP, which gave us great hope.
The national leader
legislate to give Aborigines land rights. Because all of us as Australians are diminished, while the Aborigines are denied their rightful place in this nation.
We had great hopes for Gough Whitlam, and I still regard Gough Whitlam as being the greatest Australian Prime Minister there's ever been in my lifetime, but he reneged on his promise for land rights. And that's why the Aboriginal Embassy is back on the lawns in Parliament House in Canberra to this day, folks, as a symbol of the duplicity and deceit of the successive Australian governments of all political persuasions. I want to leap forward to 1981. 1981, a group of Aboriginal people, including myself, travelled to Aotearoa, the land of the wrong white crowd. Sorry, that's a Maori joke, folks. To participate in the protests against the Springbok tour of New Zealand in 1981. That was a remarkable and very dangerous exercise. New Zealand went to the edge of civil war. Not a lot of people know this, in 1981 over a game of rugby. And yet one of the great things, one of the greatest experiences of my life was the three Aboriginal people you're about to see in this little clip. We actually got onto the field in Hamilton. The only time in the history of apartheid sport when a game was actually stopped, especially a particularly important game of rugby in New Zealand, and where there was a small group of us got onto the field, stopped the game, and then when the announcement was made that the game had been stopped, we were surrounded by 25,000 crazy rugby supporters determined to kill us. And it's the most dangerous thing that I've ever been involved in my life, and it's one of the proudest moments of my life because we really upset all of those Afrikaners back there in South Africa when they realised that their game wasn't going to go ahead.
There are Aboriginal people that have come out here to support Māori women against the tour and to support other Māori organisations in general against the tour.
Basically, we came here to express solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Black in South Africa, as well as to express solidarity with those Maori groups which are opposed to the tour and all anti-racist people in New Zealand. The simple fact of the matter is that in Australia, we're not going to achieve land rights and self-determination, all our other aims, without international solidarity being expressed with us. And one of the ways in which we see that is to the black peoples of Africa and the black peoples of New Zealand and the Pacific to see that we actively support their cause. And we'll go anywhere in the Pacific or anywhere in the world to express solidarity with those oppressed peoples who seek our active support.
"1983 was the biggest betrayal of Aboriginal people in the 20th century, brought about by this scoundrel. 1983, Bob Hawke was elected Prime Minister of Australia. He was conscious of Whitlam selling us out 10 years before, and he declared that his government would deliver to the Aboriginal people national uniform land rights legislation. And he promised to achieve that by overriding recalcitrant state governments by Commonwealth legislation if necessary, power that had been given by the 1967 referendum. Well, folks, that promise didn't last long. Bob Hawke was summoned to Western Australia by this criminal, and I use the term advisedly, folks, and I would also add corrupt criminal. This man, Brian Burke, was the then Labor Premier of Western Australia. He was also the national president of the Australian Labor Party. Later on, Burke served 7 months jail in 1994 for corrupt practices, and in 1997 was jailed again for corruption. This Premier is today regarded as one of the most corrupt Australian politicians in history, and yet he was able to summon Bob Hawke to Western Australia and tell Bob Hawke to forget the Abos and to forget national land rights legislation.
After the meeting, Hawke effectively cancelled Labor Party policy which would have given Aborigines the right to control resources on their own land.
That's what happened to land rights, folks. That was the death of the land rights movement. Everything that's happened since has been a pathetic, meaningless charade. That's why Aboriginal people are in a worse situation today than they were when I was 17, when I got the fire in my belly to fight for our rights. And there was really this moment in history that really destroyed the aspirations of Aboriginal people. And that's why the Aboriginal people have ever since regarded Bob Hawke as the most reviled, disgusting, offensive, unprincipled, racist politician in history. And so therefore, folks, we were a little bit perplexed when in 1990 it seemed that Bob Hawke was going to try and use Nelson Mandela as a means of re-establishing some sort of credibility for himself on issues of race.
Today he's a celebrity, feted on every continent by the world's leaders.
You now know who I am. I am a Yankee. I consider myself an honorary Irishman from Soweto.
By now, Nelson Mandela is probably an honorary citizen of most of those countries he's visited. Who knows, maybe Bob Hawke will even make him an honorary Australian. But the one thing he'll never be is an honorary Aborigine, because the people who struggled for his cause for so many years in this country say he's sold them down the creek.
The reality of what Mandela and the ANC are going to be doing in Australia in the next 3 days is that it amounts to hypocrisy. It's as simple as that.
Gary Foley has been an Aboriginal activist for 20 of those 27 years Mandela spent in prison. To Foley, Mandela was a hero and his cause a great one until this visit. So it seems extraordinary that he and other Aborigines should now be saying Mandela is a hypocrite.
The ANC and Mandela are turning their backs on the people who supported them, and they are in essence sucking up to the people who hated and despised them when he was in jail. They're dealing with people who used words like terrorists and communists for the ANC when Nelson Mandela was in jail, and they're going to be rubbing shoulders with people who are very much bandwagon jumpers when it comes to the cause of the ANC. Now, that in anybody's terms is political hypocrisy.
The crux of the issue is Mandela's refusal to comment on Aboriginal issues. The Aborigines see this as blatant betrayal. Mandela has a different way of explaining it.
Well, we do not wish to get involved in the internal affairs of every country.
I put it to you, folks, that if the world would have had that position for all those years that Nelson was in jail, he probably would have died in jail. And it's not as though we were seeking at that moment in history too much from Nelson. All we wanted was for him to either make a statement, come and visit an organisation, that's all, nothing more than that. And when you consider that almost 10 years earlier, another leader of a former resistance movement in the Pacific, who became a Prime Minister of the newly independent nation of Vanuatu, Walter Linney was put under intense pressure by the Australian government to not mention anything to do with Aboriginal people, which is what Bob Hawke was putting on Nelson at the time of that visit there. Walter Linney chose honourably to ignore the pressure, even though the Australian government was using the threat of cutting off or restricting Australian aid to the newly established nation of Vanuatu. Walter Linney stood up against the Australian government, and there were no repercussions for Vanuatu. But the person who we regarded as the greatest hypocrite in that whole exercise wasn't Nelson Mandela in the final analysis. It was that filthy scumbag Bob Hawke, who set about trying to big note himself. He claimed later, when Nelson passed away, Bob Hawke tried to claim that Nelson had confided in him that it was Bob Hawke's idea to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Bob Hawke claimed that that Nelson Mandela had privately confided in him a whole range of things, that, the role that Bob Hawke had played in bringing an end to apartheid. which was nonsense. You know, when Nelson did get out of jail, one of the first leaders in the Commonwealth he went and visited wasn't in Australia at all. He went and visited the Prime Minister of Canada and expressed great appreciation for the role that Canada had played within the Commonwealth in trying to bring an end to apartheid. So at the end of the day, it was Bob Hawke who was the really bad person in all of that. However, in 2013, and this is where I hope to put this in a little bit of context, SBS reported me as saying, but Dr. Foley admits even at the time of Mr. Mandela's visit, a part of him understood how the pressures came to bear on the man. And he says it has not changed and never did. His feelings towards the man who, as a prisoner on South Africa's Robben Island, was one of his great heroes in his teens. He is one of the great men of history. There is no two ways about that. His story is one of the great inspirational stories of history. I always have regarded, even in my moments of anger with what happened in 1990, I always have regarded Nelson Mandela as a great inspiration. He most certainly was one of the people who fired me on when I was a 17, 18-year-old, knowing what was going on with him at the time. Him breaking rocks in Robben Island under the eyes of racist warders. I mean, you know, we thought about that a lot in our struggle in Redfern, and we supported him then, and we supported him in the end till the day he died. It was just a great pity that he missed the opportunity to repay some of the support that we'd given the ANC and himself in that short visit in 1999. But like I say, the person who led him astray at that moment in history was the great scumbag of Australian history, Mr. Bob Hawke, folks. And one of the great things that occurred post-apartheid, of which I've always said Australia should have taken a lot more notice of, was the great thing of establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because you can't have reconciliation without justice. That's one of my mantras in Australia. And yet Australian government, the Labor government of Paul Keating, set up this Mickey Mouse thing called a reconciliation. They created a Council of Aboriginal Reconciliation, without confronting the truth of Australian history and without bringing some of the criminals to justice for the crimes that have been committed against Aboriginal people. There can be no justice. There can be no reconciliation. And I call again tonight on the Australian government to do something about creating some sort of a body that addresses the past, addresses history, because without that, too many Aboriginal people, well, we're never going to get justice. To talk about inserting a clause in the Constitution is a nonsense. It will achieve nothing. But today, in the world of post-Pauline Hanson in Australia, the possibility of any referendum question put to the Australian people actually getting up has a snowball's chance in hell, because, you know, in 1967 there was a vast reservoir of goodwill that had been built up in support of justice for Aboriginal people. That's why that referendum was so historic. That vast reservoir of goodwill has dissipated. It's gone. And one last final thing. The Royal Commission in Aboriginal Deaths in Custody that I worked on was set up 25, almost 30 years ago, because Aboriginal people were being jailed at a rate greater than almost anyone on earth. The Royal Commission found that Aboriginal people were among the most jailed people on earth. And the Royal Commission found that it wasn't because Aboriginal people are any more criminal than anyone else. They found that they were going to jail at those rates because of the embedded racism within the all levels of the Australian criminal justice system. The 300 recommendations of the Royal Commission were designed to stop Aboriginal people going to jail at the rate that they were. We now have a situation, almost 30 years later, where there are far more Aboriginal people in jail today than there ever have been. So that as one single indicator should clearly show all Australians that we not only have not come anywhere, we've not progressed in any way, we've actually gone backwards. And so, you know, if Nelson's there looking down on me tonight, he would want me to say, Australia, you need to do something. You need to wake up. You need to draw on the inspiration of one of the greatest men in history, in world history, Nelson Mandela, and make amends. Thank you.
Wow. Where does one go from there? Thank you so much, Professor Gary Foley, for that moving education that we all got today. Thank you, thank you. And he quietly asked me to apologize on his behalf for going on and on and on. But I think it was worth it. I think everybody's happy that we all got to experience that. So just one more time, let's just give Gary Foley a round of applause. Professor Foley is not dead, because he's gone on for so long. He feels like there will be no opportunity for Q&As unless if... And he's exhausted too. Pardon? Yes, we can have a conversation outside. There'll be an opportunity. Actually, that's what I was going to say now, that there'll be some refreshments served outside. So it'll be a great opportunity to get to have a chat with Professor Foley. Yes, and also just to mention a couple of key supporters for this event. The City of Melbourne, RMIT, of course, the reason we're all here. So thank you for offering us this beautiful space and for helping us to get to this, you know, how far we've gotten. And Multicultural Arts Victoria, thank you so much as well. And Multicultural, or Victorian Multicultural Commission as well. All these bodies, you know, we greatly appreciate the work that they do and the continued support to see the community work that we do to try and teach a bit of history and to also encourage cohesion within the multicultural society. So, what's next? I think that's it. And now, just quickly, I would like to finally introduce John Bellavance, who is the Vice President of Nelson Mandela Celebration, Melbourne, as well as the Vice President of Universal Peace Federation, Australia. John Bellavance, everyone.
Wow. What can I say after that, right? Look, from my accent, you can probably tell I'm from Clayton. Actually, I'm from Canada originally. I'm a new Australian. And I was welcomed to this country by a friend of mine who passed away, whom I miss very much, is Reg Blow, if you know Reg Blow. Reg and I worked together on many issues. Look, Dr. Foley, thank you for your inspiring remarks, and let us reflect on the importance, certainly, to really remind us of the history of white Australia and the fight that went on, and frankly, that obviously still goes on. So obviously, Aboriginal people have struggled against apartheid laws in Australia, and you gave us a very good history of this and the history of the change in the Constitution, but in the end you said it's about self-determination, economic independence, and land rights. So I think if we go away from today, we probably get that. And for me, the last message of all is that the struggle goes on. And based on that, I'd just like to share my own remarks, and that is that based on the peace-building principles of Dr. Moon, the founder of the organization that I work with, the Universal Peace Federation, I'd like to also do a little bit of analysis of history. I'm also a fan of history. And I'd like to apply that to the struggle that Mandela undertook. And this struggle is based on a pattern. It's based on the pattern of those who struggled in history, and it's based on the pattern that I have seen with my brothers and sisters in the African community or anyone who struggles for justice. And that is a pattern to fight against what's wrong, and what's evil is not easy. And evil appears very strong at first, but in fact it declines because it has no moral authority. So I suggest that Mandela's life followed actually this historic pattern. First, that the liberation of people must begin with the liberation of the individual. I suspect that Mandela had to overcome his own anger and resentment to become the master of forgiveness. A U.S. Congressman, Simpson, said once that he made peace with himself, peace with the horror of what he went through, and decided, as my mother would say, that hatred corrodes the container that it's carried in. Dr. King, the civil rights leader that inspired me, said that he needed to free himself from his own slave mentality first. Second, those individuals who stood up to evil did this based on values. Third, they fought against what was wrong, not only for themselves, but for others. And fourth, this struggle involved a personal sacrifice. Mandela said to a member of U.S. Congress, he said, "Patrick, because of my imprisonment, I was able to lead my country out of apartheid, and for that I feel no bitterness at all, but joy." And fifth, this struggle began from a position of a servant or a prisoner. There is a pattern in history that the people who stood for right often started even like in the position of a simple servant or prisoner. Dr. King, and civil rights leader, saw going to prison as a badge of honor. When Dr. Moon went to prison, Joseph Lowry, an old civil rights leader, told his daughter, "Don't worry, darling, because God's in jail with your daddy." Finally, after some time of struggle, after a time of struggle and personal sacrifice, they could be elevated to the position of dignity and honor. Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize. Gandhi's struggle against British rule led him to become the father of a nation, and yet peace builders also fought to elevate their enemies, exemplified in the life of Mandela. Nelson Mandela is a shining example of this historic pattern. He walked in the shoes of a prisoner and was elevated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize and became the father of the nation and even forgave and embraced his enemies. Let us all honor him as we seek to liberate our brothers and sisters. I want to acknowledge also tonight the love and sacrifice of my amazing African Australian leaders who are here tonight, and many who are not that I don't see, but I know. I just want to say, keep going on. You are a shining light of hope and love, and you have kept me inspired, and I'm grateful for the work that you have done. Thank you, Dr. Foley, for your presentation. Thank you for the work. And I am grateful to be here tonight because I recognize the work that needs to be done. And sometimes we need to get that fire in our belly reignited so that we can go on and live a life that is meaningful. And with glad I close with Dr. King's word, who was an inspiration to me. He said, "Anyone can be great because anyone can serve." Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our program, or at least in this room. But before we go, I would not dare ask you to stand up. I will come to you, Professor Gary Foley. We've just got a little gift for you to thank you for your commitment. We understand that this is particularly a difficult time in your family at the moment, but we truly appreciate that you've made time to come and share so passionately a very important part of Australian history. So thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Let's go outside and let's go hang out.